It's not like we're married.
Richie, 1 week is a crush, 2 weeks...
There was a time when Tuesday nights meant one thing in millions of American households. The Cunninghams, Arnold's Drive-In, and a greaser in a leather jacket who could fix a jukebox with a single tap of his fist. For a good stretch of the 1970s, no show on television came close to touching it, and then, slowly, it didn't. This is the story of Happy Days, 1974, how the sitcom smash hit fell apart. Part 7, Where It All Began, a pilot nobody wanted. Before Happy Days was ever a household name, it was a piece of paper sitting in a drawer that nobody wanted to open. In 1971, television writer and producer Gary Marshall, who had already made a name for himself working on The Dick Van Dyke Show and producing The Odd Couple, put together a pilot for ABC. He called it New Family in Town. It was a gentle, warmly lit story about a 1950s family in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The dad ran a hardware store, the mom kept the house together, and the teenage son named Richie Cunningham was doing his best to figure out girls, friendship, and growing up. Ron Howard played Richie, Marion Ross played his mother, and Anson Williams played Richie's best friend, Patsy Weber. A BC passed on it, no interest. So Marshall sold the footage to the producers of Love, American Style, a comedy anthology series on ABC that was well known at the time for quietly airing unsold pilots to get their money's worth. The segment was retitled Love and the Television Set and aired on February 25, 1972. It barely made a ripple, and that might have been the end of it, except for one man, George Lucas. In 1973, Lucas was deep in pre-production on a film called American Graffiti. He was looking for the right faces to fill out a story about teenagers in early 1960s California, specifically the kind of wholesome, relatable young faces that would feel authentic. His casting director, Fred Roos, suggested Ron Howard. Lucas tracked down Marshall's old pilot, screened it, and immediately cast Howard in the film. American Graffiti opened in 1973 and became one of the highest-grossing films of the year. Suddenly, the 1950s and early 1960s were back, not just in movie theaters, but in the cultural conversation. The Broadway musical Grease had already been running to packed houses since 1972. The nostalgia wave was real, and it was building fast. A BC watching all of this remembered that they had a 1950s-themed pilot already sitting in the vault. They called Gary Marshall and asked him to make it into a series. Among the changes ABC requested was the addition of a new character. A greaser, a tough kid, a biker from the wrong side of town named Arthur Fonzarelli. Happy Days premiered on January 15, 1974.
Yes, can I help you, sir?
No, sir, I'm a new kid.
Part 6, The Early Seasons, a different kind of show. The Happy Days that premiered in January 1974 was not the Happy Days most people remember. Not quite. The first 2 seasons were filmed single camera style with a laugh track, closer in feel to a small, earnest film than a big, bright television production. The stories were grounded. Richie Cunningham and his friend Patsy Weber navigated high school, girls, and the minor anxieties of middle-class Midwestern life. Their world felt genuinely of the 1950s. Soda fountains, Letterman jackets, family dinners, the quiet hum of suburban certainty. Fonzie was there, but only barely. He appeared as a supporting character, mostly in the background. A leather-clad mechanic who turned heads but didn't dominate the story. And there was a telling detail in those early seasons. ABC's standards department had insisted that Fonzie wear a cloth jacket rather than the leather one, worried that the leather made him seem too threatening, too much of a bad influence. Gary Marshall negotiated a compromise. Fonzie could wear the leather jacket, but only when he was near or on his motorcycle. Since Fonzie was almost always near his motorcycle in those first episodes, it worked out. The opening theme in Season 1 was a new recording of Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets, which fit the nostalgic mood perfectly.
Juggles pretty well. So what? We can see that every Sunday night at Ed Sullivan's.
The original 1954 recording even returned to the Billboard charts in 1974, partly due to its use on the show. The show also featured Ron Howard's One Condition before signing on. Having grown up on camera playing Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show from 1960 to 1968, Howard had no interest in being locked into playing a teenager forever. It was one of the peculiarities of the television business at the time that child actors could find themselves repeating the same grade, attending the same school dances, fretting over the same math tests for years on end with no end in sight. Howard wanted no part of that. Before agreeing to return as Richie Cunningham, he made Gary Marshall promise that his character would be allowed to age in real time, from high school into college and beyond. Marshall agreed and held to it. Over the first several seasons, Richie did age. He went from high school to the University of Wisconsin. He got a steady girlfriend. He started thinking about the future. It was a small but meaningful commitment to realism in a show that would, in later years, drift quite far from it. Chuck Cunningham, Richie's older brother, was there in those first 2 seasons too. Played first by Gavin O'Herlihy and then briefly by Randolph Roberts. Then, without explanation, Chuck simply vanished. He stopped appearing. Nobody on the show ever mentioned him again. It became one of the stranger footnotes in television history and eventually gave rise to the term Chuck Cunningham syndrome, used to describe characters who disappear from shows without any acknowledgement that they ever existed. The ratings for those first 2 seasons were modest. Not a failure, but not a hit either. The show drew a decent enough audience, but it wasn't breaking through the way ABC had hoped. Something had to change.
Oh, where would he get anything like that?
By following his sister, Hot Lips McDonald.
Part 5. The Fonzie Effect. A show finds its magic. By the time Season 3 arrived in the fall of 1975, Gary Marshall had made a decision. He was going to lean into Fonzie hard. The production shifted to a 3-camera setup filmed in front of a live studio audience, which gave the show a louder, warmer, more energetic feel. The new theme song, the one that became truly iconic, written by Charles Fox and Norman Gimbel and recorded by Pratt and McLean, replaced Rock Around the Clock as the opening of the show. Henry Winkler's name, previously buried in the closing credits, began climbing toward the top of the billing. Fonzie moved into the apartment above the Cunningham garage. He was now present in nearly every episode, woven into the daily life of the family, and the audience responded in a way that nobody could quite have predicted. Fonzie became a phenomenon. Arthur Fonzarelli had started out as a brooding, slightly menacing outsider, but in Marshall's hands, and through Winkler's instincts as a performer, something interesting happened. The edges softened. Fonzie became protective rather than threatening, loyal rather than dangerous. He was the cool uncle, the one who could settle any dispute with a look, fix anything mechanical, and deliver wisdom with a casual authority that Richie's clean-cut world couldn't quite produce on its own. The dynamic between the two of them, the innocent all-American boy and the street-smart greaser, gave the show something to work with that was genuinely fresh for its time. By the 1976 to 77 television season, Happy Days was the #1 program in all of American television. It had ended the 5-year Nielsen dominance of All in the Family. On any given week, the show was pulling in tens of millions of viewers. Part of what made the show's dominance so striking was how thoroughly it had rebuilt itself from the inside.
She's a nice lady.
She's always pinching my cheeks. I get a bruised face.
The earliest episodes had a quieter, more reflective quality. Single camera, no studio audience, a show that was comfortable sitting with a moment rather than driving toward a punchline. The multi-camera version was louder, faster, and built to generate applause and laughter on cue. Both versions had their strengths, but the audience clearly preferred the energy of the later format. Gary Marshall had gone through the same transition with The Odd Couple a few years earlier, so he knew exactly what he was doing. Fonzie was everywhere. His face was on lunchboxes, on posters, on t-shirts, on school notebooks. Toy stores carried Fonzie action figures. There were Fonzie Halloween costumes. The merchandising was staggering for its era. Henry Winkler, who had quietly negotiated a percentage of syndication profits in exchange for keeping his salary relatively modest, was quietly becoming a very wealthy man. There was also a near crisis during this peak period that didn't come from ratings or the press, but from within the production. At the height of Fonzie's popularity, ABC executives pushed to rename the show Fonzie's Happy Days, believing that the character's name on the title would drive even bigger numbers. Both Ron Howard and Henry Winkler pushed back hard. Howard later said he wasn't bluffing when he told the producers he would leave if the title changed. Winkler, for his part, believed it would be insulting to the rest of the ensemble, who had all put their work into making the show what it was. Gary Marshall sided with his cast. The title stayed. In the spring of 1976, the show launched its first proper spin-off, Laverne and Shirley, following two young women working in a Milwaukee brewery. It was created by Marshall and starred Penny Marshall, Gary's own sister, alongside Cindy Williams, who had also appeared in American Graffiti alongside Ron Howard. Laverne and Shirley would go on to be one of the biggest hits of the late 1970s in its own right. Happy Days was, at this point, more than a television show. It was a machine.
Time he comes to this house, he wears the same shirt.
What are you doing, Daddy?
Part 4, The Shark in the Water. September 20th, 1977. The opening episode of Season 5, a 3-part story called Hollywood. The premise sent the gang to California, where Richie was being considered for a film contract, and Fonzie found himself challenged by a smug beach bully known as the California Kid. The challenge, eventually accepted on Fonzie's behalf by Ralph and Potsy, was a water skiing contest, with the final tiebreaker being a jump over a shark contained in a netted area in the ocean. The idea for the scene had come, at least in part, from Henry Winkler's own life. His father had suggested to him that he mention his water skiing skills to the producers. When Winkler finally did, the writers built a scene around it. Winkler executed the stunt himself, in his signature leather jacket and a pair of white shorts. According to episode writer Fred Fox Jr., no one on the writing staff, in the cast, or at the network raised any serious objection to the scene before it aired. It was simply another stunt in a show that had been doing bigger and broader stories for a couple of seasons already. The episode drew roughly 30 million viewers. It was a hit, but the reaction among some in the cast was more complicated. Ron Howard later recalled that he and Donnie Most, who played Ralph Malph, sat together looking at the script before filming and had misgivings. Most was upset about where the show seemed to be going creatively. Howard told him to relax, that a hit show could survive one outlandish moment. Howard later admitted that Most probably had a clearer read on the direction things were taking. The phrase, jumping the shark, didn't actually enter the language for another decade. It was coined by Sean Connolly, a University of Michigan student, around 1987, and popularized in 1997 when his former college roommate John Hine launched the website jumptheshark.com which cataloged the moments when beloved television shows took a turn for the worse.
You got my English homework for me?
Oh, sure. And the biology.
Oh, great.
The Happy Days episode became its most famous example. Fred Fox Jr., who wrote the episode, later pushed back on the assessment in a 2010 op-ed in the Los Angeles Times. He pointed to the ratings, to the show's continued top-tier performance for years afterward, and to what he considered the larger unfairness of singling out one stunt in an otherwise entertaining three-part story. He had a reasonable point. The show remained in the top 25 for 5 of the 6 seasons that followed. It wasn't a cliff edge, but something had shifted in the internal logic of the show, something harder to measure than ratings. Fonzie, originally a dangerous edge, had by this point become a near mythological figure who could do no wrong. The motorcycle was barely in the picture anymore. The leather jacket was the only thing that remained. He was, as one commentator put it, being gradually converted into a good role model, which stripped away the very thing that had made him so compelling in the first place. And that same season 5 introduced something that was, in retrospect, arguably stranger than the shark, an alien. An episode called My Favorite Orkin featured a young, unknown comedian named Robin Williams as Mork, a visitor from the planet Ork who arrived in Milwaukee to study human beings and briefly tried to take Richie back to his homeworld. The episode was surreal, funny, and completely unlike anything that had come before in the show's run. The cast and network executives were so taken with Williams that they signed him to a contract within 4 days before any competing network could make an offer. By 1978, Mork had his own show, Mork and Mindy, and Robin Williams was on his way to becoming one of the most recognizable comedians in the world. The shark and the alien had arrived in the same season. The show survived both.
And Trudy, and a Nash seat. Oh man, we got it made in the shade. Let's go, Rich.
Part 3. The cracks begin to show. Through the late 1970s, Happy Days remained a top-rated program, but the seams were starting to show in ways that didn't always register on Nielsen charts. The writing had drifted from the grounded, character-driven stories of the early seasons into something more reliant on spectacle and formula. Each new season opener seemed to require a major event, a trip somewhere exotic, a physical stunt, a crisis that only Fonzie could resolve. There was the Dude Ranch season premiere. There were the Hollywood episodes. The show had developed a habit of reaching for scale rather than character. Fonzie's relationship with reality had also become increasingly difficult to take seriously. In the early seasons, he was a plausible, if idealized, version of the neighborhood tough. By the late 1970s, he was capable of things that bordered on the supernatural. His reputation was so enormous that merely invoking it could resolve any conflict. He had become a cartoon version of himself, which was somewhat literally true, as the Fonz and the Happy Days Gang, an animated Hanna-Barbera series, began airing in 1980. Meanwhile, the show's original ensemble was quietly being dismantled. Ralph Malph and Patsy Weber, who had been central to the show's early dynamic, were steadily pushed toward the margins. They became comic relief, filling in around the edges of stories that no longer really needed them.
Get ready, get set, bottoms up! You
Patsy had always been the more earnest of the two, the one who would break into song at the slightest provocation, the reliable straight man in almost any situation. Ralph was the jokester, the one with the punchline always already half out of his mouth. In the early seasons, the three of them together, Richie, Patsy, Ralph, had a genuine chemistry that felt like actual teenage friendship. By the later seasons, Patsy and Ralph were guests in their own show. And then, at the end of season 7 in 1980, Ron Howard left. He had been building toward this for years. Even as Richie Cunningham was growing up on screen, from high school to college to young adulthood, Ron Howard was growing up behind the camera too, directing his first film in 1977, a comedy called Grand Theft Auto. By 1980, he had decided that his future was in directing, and Happy Days was taking up time he wanted to spend elsewhere. Richie Cunningham was written out of the show by leaving to join the United States Army. Donnie Most left at the same time, with Ralph Malph also heading off to serve. The two characters who had been with the show from the very beginning, the boys whose ordinary lives had given the series its shape and its heart, were gone. Fonzie was now the unambiguous center of the show. He was also a man without much left to become.
Just sit here, dear, and I'll get some aspirin.
Well,
Part 2, The Final Years, a show without its soul. When season 8 began in the fall of 1980, Happy Days was a fundamentally different program. In Richie's absence, the show shifted focus toward a younger generation, Joni Cunningham, played by Aaron Moran, and Fonzie's young cousin Chechi, played by Scott Baio, whose romance had been developing in the background for a couple of seasons. Ted McGinley joined the cast as Roger Phillips, a new physical education teacher and nephew to Howard and Marion Cunningham, one of several new characters brought in to freshen the ensemble. Richie and Lori Beth were married by telephone in season 8, with Fonzie standing in for the absent groom at the ceremony. It was a scene that captured, in a quiet way, just how much the show had drifted from its original setup. The two main characters of the series united in a moment where one of them wasn't even in the room. In 1982, Joni and Chachi were given their own spin-off, Joni Loves Chachi, set in Chicago as the two pursued careers in music. The show finished in the top 20 during its first season, but fell dramatically when it was moved to a different time slot in its second year. It was canceled in 1983, and both characters returned to Happy Days for the final season. Howard and Marion Cunningham, played throughout the run with warmth and consistency by Tom Bosley and Marion Ross, remained, and they were in many ways the most stable thing left in a show that was constantly rotating its younger cast. Bosley and Winkler were out the only two performers to appear in all 255 episodes. That kind of continuity mattered. Ron Howard returned for guest appearances in the final season. He came back as Richie, now with a wife, a son, and a career as a screenwriter in California. A fictional life that tracked fairly closely with what the real Ron Howard was building outside the studio. He appeared again for the series finale, Passages, which aired May 8, 1984, and served as both Joni and Chachi's wedding and a farewell to the show as a whole. Howard and Marion addressed the audience directly at the end, thanking them for being part of the family. In the summer and early fall of 1984, 5 additional episodes that ABC had been unable to air during the regular season were broadcast. The very last one, Fonzie's Spots, aired on September 24th, 1984. It was quiet, as endings often are. The show that had dominated the Nielsen charts just a few years earlier slipped off the air with barely a headline.
Let your head down. Here goes. Watch move.
Part 1, What It Left Behind. The numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. Happy Days ran for 11 seasons and 255 episodes. It spawned 7 spin-off series, including 2 animated productions. Of those spin-offs, Laverne and Shirley ran 8 seasons and was itself one of the top-rated programs of the late 1970s. Mork and Mindy ran 4 seasons and launched one of the great comedic careers of the 20th century. The show was directly or indirectly responsible for giving careers to Ron Howard, Henry Winkler, Scott Baio, Robin Williams, and Penny Marshall, among many others. The reach of the show extended into corners that weren't always immediately obvious. George Lucas's seed money for Star Wars came largely from the profits of American graffiti, which itself exists in part because of Gary Marshall's rejected pilot featuring Ron Howard. The chain of events is genuinely remarkable when you trace it backward. A sitcom pilot that nobody wanted in 1971 set off a sequence that touched some of the biggest entertainment events of the decade. Happy Days sat near the center of that, even if most people watching Tuesday night television had no idea. Pat Morita, who played Arnold the diner owner in the show's early seasons, left to pursue other projects and was eventually replaced by Al Molinaro as Al Del Vecchio. Morita would go on to play Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid in 1984, the same year Happy Days ended, becoming one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema of the mid-1980s. Tom Bosley, who played Howard Cunningham with an unwavering warmth that became the emotional anchor of the series, passed away in 2010 at the age of 83. Erin Moran, who had been with the show from childhood as Joni, died in 2017. Al Molinaro passed away in 2015. Gary Marshall himself, the man who had kept the whole enterprise running through its highs and its quieter lows, died in 2016 at the age of 81. Fonzie's leather jacket, the one he wore through most of the series, not the gray windbreaker that ABC had initially insisted upon in season 1 before relenting, was donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History in 1980. It sits there still. The phrase, "jump the shark," born from a single episode of a single season, became a permanent fixture of the English language. It entered dictionaries. It appeared in newspapers, in academic papers, in casual conversation. It outlived the show that gave it its name by decades and continues to circulate today. A peculiar kind of immortality for an episode that its own writer felt was treated unjustly by history. What did in Happy Days was not any single moment, no matter what the phrase suggests. What happened was slower and more ordinary than a shark jump. The show lost its original cast. It lost the character dynamics that had made its early seasons feel alive. It stretched a formula past the point where the formula could still surprise anyone. A show built around the idea of growing up eventually ran out of growing to do. For those who watched it in its prime, Tuesday nights in the mid to late 1970s, the whole family in the living room, Fonzie's leather jacket catching the studio lights, the memory of it is something particular. There was a warmth to that show, a genuine sweetness under all the catchphrases and the cool guy posturing that very few television programs have managed to replicate since. It meant something to people. It still does. Howard and Marion Cunningham got their farewell. Richie got to come home. Fonzie, in the end, bought a house and adopted a child and finally had a family of his own. For a show that started as a pilot nobody wanted sitting in a drawer at ABC, that's not a bad place to land. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps. And if there's a classic show you'd like to see covered next, leave it in the comments below.